All right, so this is where we left off with the first video of Versailles showing the evolution. This is showing the court of honor, the most inner court, and right at the center, right in this area here, would become Louis XIV's bedchamber. And symbolically, he placed it at the center of the chateau so that he was, the center of the court and, of course, of France itself. This is a rendering from 1668 showing an earlier stage. It had started as a hunting lodge by his father, Louis XIII. And Louis XIV really, the Louvre Palace was the main royal palace in Paris, which we were talking about last time. And he really wanted a place outside of the city. Paris he was surrounded by the mob that would later take off the head of Louis XVI. But he really wanted to have a place where he could spread out, have extensive gardens, and get away from some of the pressures of being in the city itself. Just like people today, want to move out of the city and have a little suburban house with their own little yard and garden, just on a slightly exaggerated scale. This is a similar view, and some of the original or very old portion of the facades with the brick and stone are still visible here in the early court of honor in this area. The rest of it would be later expanded and altered more with a stone design. Here's the court of honor. And you can see this is somewhat Baroque because of all the gilding and the extravagant use of materials of marbles and gilding and decoration, but it has a classical Renaissance base to it. You can even see some of the pilasters. And as we talked about with French Renaissance, it has the pitched slate roofs, it has the dormers, and on occasion it has chimneys and so forth that were more typical, and the large French windows, the sort of casement windows that open out, these were typical of French Renaissance that continue on through into the Baroque period as well. Here's a view from 1722. And this is the rear facade, so the view from the gardens. This element that we're seeing was designed by Louis Leveau and added or altered by Jules Hardouin Mansart, the nephew of Francois Mansart that we talked about last time. He had been the father of the French Baroque and was very influential to the other French architects that came after him, including his nephew, Jules Hardouin, who got to work at Versailles. This was pretty cool. When I was there in 2009 last in the gardens, they had these sculptures of important architects. So here's Norman Foster. We'll be talking about him later in the semester. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool to be in Versailles and see all these architect figures here. Just some views from the gardens. This is the rear. You can see a little bit of the chapel here. I thought it's funny in the video where they talk about how he had to have an opera house. Louis XV added in an opera house because every good king must have an opera house in his palace, I guess. But this gives you a sense of just how extensive this is. It is massive, and the entire court and government basically functioned out of the chateau here. Here's a view of Jules Hardouin Mansart. So he came a little later. He was the next generation after Louis Leveau and André Lenotre and the others that worked on the early parts of Versailles. Here's a view of his bedchamber, the one that gets added at the very end of Louis XIV's life. And you can see the extensive gilding that is included in here. There's some who say, well, the building and expansion of Versailles bankrupted the French monarchy, and that helped lead to the revolution. There's no question he spent lavishly on the palace here, but really it was the wars, the constant warfare, mostly with England, that wound up bankrupting and creating financial distress on France that would lead to the French Revolution, including payrolling, basically paying for the American Revolution. it doesn't get talked about a lot in American history, but we won the American Revolution because the French gave us their army and their navy and all the funds to support that. Without that, we probably would not have won that war. Here's the famous Hall of Mirrors, or Galerie de Glace in French. This is from 1678. This was the edition, one of the editions by Jules Hardouin Massat. This is an incredibly important space in world history. This is the room that the peace treaty ending World War I was signed. And when I was in Versailles, it was at the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and the Soviet Union was essentially disintegrating. And there was a massive summit that was held in Paris, and they had an event here in the Hall of Mirrors one evening. And so me and a bunch of our classmates hung out in the courtyard out front and watched the motorcade go by of George H.W. Bush, Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of England, Gorbachev, the Russian premier, and all the other famous world leaders. And we could see each one go by, and we're like, and the Secret Service were like, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And we're like, "We're just checking out." So that was a fun night. Here's some of the paintings that are scattered throughout. Louis XIV, essentially built a cult of personality around himself, and all the art and decoration, even the fountains sometimes were meant to be symbolic of his power and sort of representing him as a deity, almost like a living god, which again was something that ultimately didn't please the French people. This is one of the galleries, the Gallery of Peace, also by Jules Hardouin Massat and Charles Le Bon. This is the throne room. So this would have been a formal reception room where the king would have sat during a formal state visit and audience. And again, heavily ornamented and decorated and gilded. So this is really Baroque in the extreme. And then the other video showed you the gardens. The gardens are extensive. The Grand Canal here, which is in a cross form, but from one end to the other is a mile long. That's how large the gardens is. And it's about a mile from the chateau down to the Grand Canal itself. And in fact, one can take a little boat rides. You can rent a little rowboat or one of those little paddle boats today when you visit the gardens, and you can, boat along the Grand Canal with your sweetheart. We would do that sometimes when I lived at Versailles. Here's the Grand Trianon, and the Petit Trianon are off to the side. So they're a couple of miles away from the main palace, and this was a little retreat first for Louis XIV. The Grand Trianon basically for his head mistress. So he would head out there sometimes and have a rendezvous with her. And then the Grand Trianon was built, or the Petit Trianon was built later by Louis XV for his mistress, so he could go and have a little rendezvous with her. And then the Hamlet, a little further afield, was built for Marie Antoinette, so she could just get away from it all. Here's some old rendering and views of the gardens. This is the Great Neptune Fountain. It's massive. This is an aerial view, nice drone view there of the gardens. You can see very much a Renaissance style garden, very symmetrical on strong axis. There's, the symmetry between the different elements. We'll be talking about a contrast to that a little later today with the 18th century. This is one of the major fountains, the Apollo fountain. This is one of the ways that ties in mythology and the gods to Louis XIV. He considered himself like the sun god, which, Apollo would rise with the sun every morning, and, the world got light and warmth from Apollo. And so symbolically, Louis XIV, every morning when he would arise, he would give warmth and light to France. Here's a view with it going. So like I say, I like the video that you were able to watch because it does show you the fountains running. They're nice to look at when they're not running, but they're more dynamic, of course, when they're actually operating. Here's a few views. So this is on what I call Fountain Day, where hordes of people come to watch the fountains running on a nice day. This is a view from the Apollo fountain back up. The chateau sits up on a hilltop, so there's a vista from the chateau downward into the Apollo fountain and the Grand Canal, which we see here. People will picnic. You can get a sandwich in town, take it down here and have a little picnic there. You can see all the boaters. Some more views of different elements of the garden. They're just massive. I mean, you really can't see everything even in a day if you visit here. Again, one of the fountain elements that we saw in the video, but without the water running. This is another tie-in to Apollo. This is a little grotto that is showing after, after sunset. Apollo is exhausted from his day of carrying the sun across the sky, so he gets tended to by a bunch of nymphets, I guess, in this little grotto here. And then here's the Grand Trianon, also in the Baroque style by Jules Hardouin Massat from 1688. And again, this was a retreat for Louis XIV and his mistress. I love the Grand Trianon because of the pink marble that they used. It's always been my favorite. Here's a nice view of that sort of reddish pink marble. It's just an exquisitely designed and proportioned building. And then here's a view of the Petit Trianon. This is really more almost Renaissance, almost 18th century, which we're going to be talking about, going back towards neoclassical architecture rather than the Baroque. And of course, late 1700s, so it really fits more into that theme that we'll be talking about a little later. I don't really have time. There were all kinds of rules and etiquettes that one had to follow in court when you were at Versailles. You can read through those later if you'd like to. And you're just some views of the royal court and formal events that could occur. Here's some views for life with the ladies or walking around the gardens. Women wore, the fashion at that time were these dresses that had hoops that just stuck their hips way out, and they would almost sometimes have to turn and go through doorways sideways because their dresses had such wide hips. I guess that was meant to emphasize some kind of femininity of hips, but it was like everything Baroque, it was in the extreme. And then this is some views of the hamlet. Again, not really a Baroque. This was much later. In fact, it's more of a neo-medieval village. But I just like to show you this is a lot of people's favorite part of Versailles, just because it's such a quaint little village-looking element here. It's all recreated. There was never a village here. It never looked anything like this. And of course, no peasant village ever looked so clean and tidy. People were throwing their chamber pots empty them into the streets from the windows, in medieval times. So, and actually, the story is that the palace stunk to high hell because everybody had chamber pots and they weren't always emptied in a timely manner. So it stank pretty bad. I wanted to point this building out. This is, I call this La Maison Gilbert. This is in the town of Versailles, a few blocks from the chateau. You don't have to know this for the quiz. This is actually where I lived when I was in my study abroad at Versailles between 1990 and 91. So it was a neat, we thought this was a palace when we walked in. There was a grand staircase. I had a bedroom over here on the right. And I had my desk in front of this window on the far right, and there was a little garden. This house was owned by a woman that was single and middle-aged at the time, and she rented out. She had so much space that she rented out rooms to students, and so there were 7 of us from the program living in this house in different rooms. So it was a pretty amazing place to live, actually. And then I want to point out there were 2 stable buildings. One actually housed the horses, and the other one housed the carriages. And this is showing an image of the La Petite Écurie, the small stable at Versailles. And this is actually where we had our classes. There was an architecture school, French architecture school, housed in the Petite Écurie, and they shared space with our program from the University of Illinois. Unfortunately, the program is no longer at Versailles. They still have the study abroad program in the junior year, but it's in Barcelona now, which is also pretty cool. But what part of my love for Paris comes from the fact that I lived in outside of Paris in Versailles. So this is one of the grand halls inside the Petit Écurie, and it's actually where the art department keeps, plaster casts and reproductions of famous sculptures. So sometimes we'd get to walk through here and see all this amazing sculptural work. It's pretty cool. Okay, I just want to finish up with French Baroque a little bit here, and one thing to continuing on the theme of Jules Hardouin-Mansart is what's known as Les Invalides, or known more formally as Saint Louis des Invalides. This is from 1670, finished in 1708. It was essentially a hospital. It was like the VA of the time, the Veterans Administration Hospital, for soldiers that had been wounded or became ill, and would treat them. And at the center of it would be a chapel where they could worship. And Mansart designed this chapel, and it's really a high point of the French Baroque. Very similar in many ways to the work of his uncle, Francois Mansart. And we see here a very tall gilded dome set on a two-story element with, Roman temple fronts. So very much taking that base of Renaissance architecture and expanding or evolving that into something much more elaborate. Here's an aerial view of the entire hospital, and there you see the chapel there. And today the chapel is used, it's kind of an honorary burial place or place of statues, a statutory hall almost of great French leaders, including the tomb of Napoleon, who after his death in 1840, he was brought back and placed in a tomb here at Les Invalides. All right, just a little bit about the Baroque in England. It's going to be quite a bit different actually than what we saw in France, and in many ways never went to the extremes. The French monarchy, or the English monarchy, never went to those extremes that the French monarchy does, and perhaps partly for those reasons, they mostly kept their heads. This is a view, I'll talk more about this. This is a view of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is one of the examples we'll be talking about. It really starts, the English Baroque starts in 1666 with a fire, not unlike the Great Fire of Chicago from 1872 that we'll be talking about, and how that launched a whole movement in architecture. But here in 1666, the city burned a big chunk of it. It was, as big or worse even than the Great Chicago Fire. And so much destruction occurred that the most prominent architect of the day, who was Christopher Wren, English architect, here he is with his big fluffy hair, he proposed a rebuilding of the city. Just like every other city in Europe, it had been a medieval city with meandering streets, no rhyme or reason to it. And just like we saw with the plan of Rome, he thought that it would be great to rebuild the city on a more organized manner, with these grand boulevards that would go from key points, usually churches and plazas, straight through to another key point, to church or plaza, and more orderly streets, not quite the grid plan that we see in Chicago today, but certainly a more organized and orderly street plan system than existed in the just random meandering streets. Unfortunately, here's a view of this. Here, a plan and a rendering that if it had been built this way, it would have looked a little something like this, including with a big column at one of the plazas and St. Paul's Cathedral at another location. Unfortunately, this was never implemented, and it wasn't implemented for really a couple of main reasons. The English monarchy was not maybe quite as all-powerful as the French monarchy and some of the the papacy had been. And so they were not able to just condemn property and slice a street through. And owners, after the fire and they lost everything, they wanted to get rebuilt. Landlords wanted to rebuild so they could get tenants back in and get their income from leasing. People who own their own property and had their home or their business there wanted to rebuild so they could reopen their business and have their home again. Makes sense. And so the effort necessary to basically rearrange properties and make sure that somebody got their property back or got bought out and all that, all those logistical complications, it just wasn't practical for the city authorities and the English monarchy to implement that. So unfortunately, Wren's grand plan for London was never implemented. Of course, later on, after the bombing by the Germans during World War II destroyed the same neighborhood again, the English were able to do more boulevard streets. So you do see a little bit of that in today's London, but only because it got blown away again. But a few things did happen out of Wren's plan. One was the construction of St. Paul's Cathedral. This started in 1675. It was finished by 1709. And here is kind of a plan view. And here you see all these meandering streets of the medieval city that Wren had wanted to get rid of. But they were able to clear out a large site with a great plaza and build a massive cathedral there. That is the English version of the Baroque. Here's a view of the old Gothic church that had been burned in the fire. And so Wren oversees the reconstruction. Initially, his plan is very much based on the early plan of St. Peter's by Bramante. It's more of a Greek cross plan with just a little extended nave and narthex at the end, and with a central crossing of a large dome. And then very Baroque, actually, in the curved, concave curves here on the sides along the perimeter. This really would have been an Italian version of the Baroque. Well, that alone was reason enough not to do it, because by this time, England is fully Protestant. And St. Paul's Cathedral is a Protestant church, not a Catholic church. And this just had too many associations with Italian, Catholicism and Roman Catholicism. And so this plan was rejected. And instead, they preferred a more traditional English layout with a long nave, a very long, deep choir and apse at the end, and a crossing. They did allow for a dome at the crossing, but really this plan is a more traditional English Gothic plan, although the architecture is Baroque, English Baroque and Renaissance. So here's a view of the front facade as it got built. There are there are Baroque elements. Mostly, it's a Renaissance building. We see a very traditional Roman temple front and the pilasters, the triangular pediments over the windows. All of this is more traditional Renaissance. But where we start to get into the Baroque elements are in these towers, these corner towers with more of the contrasting curvatures and detailing that is beyond that of just Renaissance. Here's another aerial view of it with the great dome, very much modeled on the domes that were being built, in Italy that were more traditional Renaissance. This one with an extensive colonnade that circles the drum. And the interior has, again, for the most part, a more restrained version. The English did not go overboard in the Baroque with gilding and ornamentation for the most part. Partly that's because they were not yet quite as wealthy from their colonization that the French and the Spanish were, and the Italian, the church had immense wealth from its sources. The English didn't quite have that, and then partly also from a Protestant ethic. of restraint, of not, just spending lavishly on art and architecture, but rather, focusing more directly on people's spiritual life and their salvation rather than these sort of what was seen by Protestants, many Protestants, as kind of excesses of ornamentation. In the choir area, which is the extended part beyond the dome, there was more extensive decoration, not frescoes, but mosaics and painted arches and vaulting here. So this feels a lot more Baroque in this area than the rest of the church does, and I think you can see that association a bit. Wren is also famous for designing 51 different churches in this part of London that had burned. Again, this fire had wiped out a huge chunk of the city. And so between 1670 and 1689, Wren oversees the construction of over 50 churches. Many of those were later destroyed during the Blitz, the bombing by the Nazis during World War II. But some of them survive. Some of them, just the towers survive. And it's a little surreal walking around London. In the middle there, you see there's just a tower. It looks like some kind of monument or something, and that was a church by Wren that had been largely destroyed, and many of these were not rebuilt after the war, and so all that's left are just towers. Some of them are still churches. The one on the right you can see is still a pretty intact church, and they're most famous for these towers, which are more Baroque. Many of the churches, like we saw at St. Paul's, the church architecture itself was largely Renaissance, but he would get much more decorative and creative with the various towers. And so on the left, you see, the sort of octagon shape that steps up, that creates a lot more visual interest than we would have seen in the Renaissance. Here we see more of a colonnade at the top in the center, and then on the right we see some different, not quite curvatures, but we see some conflicting curved elements that are more traditional to the Baroque. Again, not to the elaborate, extensive elaboration that the Italians and the French were doing, but it still classifies itself as Baroque because it goes and it evolves beyond just the more simplified Renaissance classical work. And architecturally speaking, we see a number of country villas designed and built, which is Castle Howard in Yorkshire. This is from 1701 by Sir John Van Brugh. Here's an image of him, again with the puffy hair, probably a wig. And very much a Palladian basis, planned on a Palladian basis. We're not done talking about Palladio, and some of you struggled with your quiz a bit and didn't heed my advice. Where if you have to guess, you might as well guess Palladio. And some of you might have done a little better had you just guessed Palladio. Not always going to happen, not always going to work out for you, but Palladio is a major theme in this part of the semester. And so here we see a central hall on axis with wings that reach out from that to create a bit of a courtyard. And that is based on the Palladian villas that we saw a few lectures ago. And here is a kind of a blurry rendering view of that. And so let me just move on to an actual image that's a little easier to see. This is the garden view from the backside, but here we see a dome on a house like we saw the dome at the Villa Rotonda by Palladio. This is a more elaborate dome and therefore makes it more of a Baroque style. We see sculptures and decorations along the roof and on the dome that make it more of a Baroque and not just a simple Renaissance style. Here's another view of it. Again, not on the scale of Versailles, certainly, but an elaborate, extensive palace that has wings that reach out to create a courtyard and then a central dome. Yeah, Joman, it does. I mean, there's obviously a secular, but the dome, because we saw so many domes in the Renaissance and in the Baroque era, when we start to see an elaborate dome like this, it makes it look like a church. But in fact, this is a dome over a central party space, just like we saw at the Villa Rotonda. which was more of a Roman style dome. This is more of a Baroque dome. Okay. Another palace, Baroque palace complex is Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. This is from 1705 and finished in 1724 by Jean Benbro and Nicholas Hawksmoor, the two architects. Here's a bust of Nicholas Hawksmoor. Doesn't have the puffy hair in that one. And similar to what we just saw, a Palladian villa plan with a central Roman temple front. We have, wings that stretch out quite extensively to create a large courtyard with a wall in front of that. Notice how some of the wings here have curved forms. That's partly what makes this Baroque. This is moving on, evolving beyond that of just the simple Renaissance forms into the curvatures and the elaborate decoration. Look here. This was a gift, actually, by the English monarchy to Blenheim, Lord Blenheim, for winning an important battle. Move on from that. Here's a view of the Marlborough family on the left, Lord Blenheim, and it's also famous. This palace or whatever is famous because this figure on the right. Hopefully, everybody recognizes that dour face of Winston Churchill, the great World War II Prime Minister hero. He was born here to an American mother, actually. It was not uncommon in the 19th century for the owners of these massive estates to marry rich American women to infuse wealth to help maintain these massive estates. And this is, in fact, what happened with Winston Churchill's father. He married an wealthy American woman who wound up being his mother. And here's a view of Blenheim Palace. So this is standing in the great courtyard, looking at the Roman temple that we first saw with Palladio doing that on one of his villas. And a little hard to tell, but there's the curved walls that create this sort of armature that reaches out that we saw with the Baroque churches in Rome, especially with the Piazza San Pietro, St. Peter's Plaza. But here being used for just a secular palace. This is just somebody's house. Here's a rendering view of it from the 18th century, showing pretty much the same thing. And a view from the backside with, again, largely Renaissance styling. But if you look at these little tower elements here on the corners, these are more Baroque. There's some curvature to them. They've got the more elaborate sculptural elements on top that are more purely decorative. And so this is partly what takes this to the next level and makes it more Baroque. Okay, so that ends our lectures on Baroque architecture and will guide us right into the next thing, which is the architecture of the 18th century. So we're ending in England in the 1700s, and we're going to really pick up here in the next lecture in the 1700s in England, talking about the next evolution of architectural styles.